We're going to have a great conversation about energy storage, about batteries, electrification. My name is John Mobanzade. I'm heading the MIT Mobility Initiative, which is a research program based at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I am really pleased today to have with us Mujeeb Ijaz, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Our Next Energy, or ONE. And ONE is an energy storage technology company based in Michigan in the United States. Now, I want to structure this kind of in four components. First, let's talk a little bit about Mujeeb. Let's get to know you, who you are, your background. Let's hear your views on battery technology, the marketplace, the tech, the challenges, et cetera. And then finally, to talk a little bit about how electric vehicle batteries fit into the energy system more holistically. And then we want to open it up to all of you. So we really want to have a great conversation here and take some questions at the end. So with that, let's get started on the first part. So Mujeeb, tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you started your career, you have more than 3 decades experience in the space. Tell us a little bit first about your days at Ford.
Very good. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, John, and thanks for the opportunity to sit down and chat about electric vehicle going backwards and now thinking about the future as well. I started working in electrification in my junior and senior year in college because General Motors had just finished the World Solar Challenge and won a solar race in Australia. They decided a workforce development initiative in the United States. It would be interesting to give college students the opportunity to design, build, and race solar cars. And so that's what kind of got me in. As I finished that project, graduated from Virginia Tech, I decided that actually mobility and electrification made a lot of sense to kind of progress my career in that direction. And so I joined Ford Electric Vehicle in the early 90s, 1992. And my first tasks at Ford evolved into battery development, where we were working on a sodium-sulfur battery and trying to develop a very high-range beginning to their electric vehicle program. And actually, sodium-sulfur was something invented by Ford back in the 60s, and they had been really researching and developing that technology for a good 2 decades before they decided to actually kick off the first program that would bring that to the market.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then, of course, you went on to A123 Systems, which was an MIT spin-off company. Tell us a little bit about that whole story.
Yeah.
So you guys were really pursuing the so-called LFP technology. Right. So if you could just define what that is and
Sure.
why it's relevant.
Well, thinking about supply chain and also coming from an automotive background, what I could see is that there lacked a bit of thinking around the birth of supply chain in the United States. And A123 as a company was emerging with LFP technology capable of very extraordinary power levels and ability to serve automotive markets, but they had not yet gotten into the automotive markets. And so as I thought about developing my career a bit more in battery, I went to work as the founder of their automotive team in Detroit. And as we kicked off that automotive effort, it became about systems engineering, pack design, battery management, then cell engineering, and eventually going into the scale-up of factories that would require automotive quality systems. And so really A123 was the first significant US-born effort to build batteries, and LFP being a technology that was valued for its safety and cost and other attributes that are still valuable today.
Yeah, now A123, of course, has this sort of incredible story tied to it, in that the company was taken public in 2009. It very quickly reached unicorn status before unicorn was even a word, having a $1 billion plus valuation. But 3 years later, it was bankrupt and acquired by Wansheng, which at the time I think was the largest Chinese tier 1 supplier.
Yeah.
So just tell us about what happened there.
You know, it's really a lessons learned around alignment of market, technology, and then the timing of scale up. Going back to Ford for a minute, we spent a decade working on the 100-mile EV with the premise that that would actually lift the market and that the market would get started. And when vehicles that were available at 100 miles came to market, the market wasn't there. And so in the premise that you can build it, they will come, you have to really understand the psychology of buyers and whether or not that really does satisfy the requirements. A123 was a progression forward. It went from 60 to 100-mile EVs to the 100 to 150-mile EV opportunity. Still, no market really did exist at that level of performance. And so I think where my lessons learned and a lot of what I'm working on now with Our Next Energy is I'm skeptical when I hear that the market is ready for this type of electric vehicle, because I look forward to, is the market truly going to adopt the levels of technology that are being proposed? And I think A123's story was the right journey a little early and the technology a little light in terms of satisfying the real market requirements. And therefore, it did not really take off at the kind of scale it would need to support itself as a public company. And public companies are also, it's a territory that I also think a lot about, and I worry that companies that rush to public markets without being EBITDA positive, knowing their yield, their revenue forecasting, and their customer base being stable enough, have the uncertainty that the public markets are just driven by fundamental metrics of profitability. They're not driven by vision, goal, and ambition. They're driven by fundamental financial performance.
Yeah.
And so I think where we are in emerging a supply chain is we should take that lessons learned and make sure that companies like one that are growing in this field are also creating a stable enough base for revenue and performance financially before they actually go into the public sector to rely on then the growth from the public markets.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to that thought, but just continuing on the trajectory of your own career, your own path. Then you were off at Apple and I think that's about all we should say about that.
About all I will say about that.
Okay, and we'll move on from that. And then you founded Our Next Energy. So tell us a little bit about sort of what is Our Next Energy? What are you guys doing?
If you think about maybe the 30 years in electric vehicle, I had sort of the view from automotive lens, the view from battery supply chain lens, and then a third view that was don't be limited by technology, just think about what the future needs, and then set a course. If you're ambitious to set that course first, you might be the first to invent something that creates a disruption. And when pandemic happened, 2020, like all of us that were experiencing something new, working from home was a very different environment. And I found myself in my head a lot more questioning what actually is going on in the industry, and is electrification at the doorstep of taking off? And if it does take off, what could be the obstacles for it being successful? And in that questioning, over about a 1-month period, I had come up with a list of 3 exact topics that I personally felt were not being addressed, would actually potentially stall the market growth, meaning we get to some level but it wouldn't grow. And the 3 topics were the range of an electric vehicle was still not enough, even though 300 miles was quite remarkable, and the advent of the 300-mile EV or 500-kilometer EV was beginning the market. My personal experience was real-world conditions, and in Europe, Autobahn is a simple example. If you drive 160 kilometers per hour, you'll lose 40 to 50% of the range predicted on the let's say advertising range of the vehicle. That's not an acceptable level of loss. And then if you go into winter conditions, it could even be worse. I decided that we should double the range of an electric car and come up with a battery that has enough energy density in the same size, same mass, effectively doubling the amount of range capability. The second topic was thermal runaway and the risk of fire due to nickel cobalt chemistries. I could see the small evidence of a number of different fires that were happening. I scaled that up in a model and said, okay, what level of adoption would you see a fire every day on the news? And it wasn't that high. And I decided that actually was a problem that needed to be solved. And the third was developing North American supply chain. We did not have a birth of manufacturing in the U.S. that actually was going to serve the market. If true transition is going to happen, there must be supplier development and ecosystem of supply chain in the U.S. So those three were the topic. It was doubling range, doing it without nickel cobalt, and then developing a North American supply chain.
Yep.
And that convinced me that if I had those three agenda items, that any one of them is sort of independently valuable, all three together could become invaluable.
Okay.
And so that's how we started the company.
That's great. So let's drill into each of those three topics: range, safety, supply chain. But first, if you could just give a kind of a 1-minute primer on battery chemistry, because I've seen you do this before, and you have a unique ability to actually explain something really complex in a simple manner. But so we have energy storage, and we have, as a subcategory of that, we have lithium-ion batteries, which, of course, are the dominant form for automotive battery applications. And then there are these kind of two categories: NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistries, which have traditionally been used, and then LFP, lithium, iron, confusingly, IRON, iron phosphate chemistries, which is what you had been working on at A123.
Yeah.
Explain to us the difference, what you see as some of the shifts that are taking place today in the marketplace between those two chemistries.
If you think about the evolution of battery chemistry and you stare at a periodic table, we've gone from lead to nickel. Eventually, we climb up to lithium. Lithium's number 3 on the periodic table. It's a lighter form of ability to harvest ions. It's becoming kind of the limit of the periodic table in terms of how you can get density. But in lithium ion, there were two fundamentally different ways to approach activating and being able to harness the value of lithium. And that related to the oxygen content or the phosphate or O4 content. And so the oxide chemistries are nickel cobalt. And what that oxide term means is that 33%, up to 33% of the cathode is mass related to oxygen. So you have this oxygen component that's built in. And so you have the ingredients you need for a fire. You have the fuel source. You have the oxygen source. All you need is a spark to set everything off. And that's what thermal runaway is all about. The second chemistry branch is phosphate. It's O4. You have an oxygen component, but it's not O2. It can't go into self-oxidizing, creating fire. It actually is bound. And in that chemistry, O4, phosphate family, you don't have the risk of thermal runaway. Now, these differ from each other by about 40% on energy density. So the typical analysis is you want to get to range, you must go nickel cobalt. LFP is something that is interesting, but it's just not there. And as I described it, you don't hit the range targets, your market doesn't exist, then you're stuck on the market side and you can't get a product out that's meaningful. What we reevaluated is that oxide chemistries, because of their safety topic, require a lot of overhead, non-cell related overhead inside the pack design to mitigate the risk of thermal runaway. We just took advantage of the fact that LFP doesn't need all of that. And then we further took advantage of the cell being part of the structure that would make the pack strong. And in doing those two things, we doubled the percentage of cell into pack volume, and it really just lifted the energy density up. So that 400 got 2x the value that the high chemistry density did in a nickel cobalt world. And we were able to exceed the energy density of LFP at a system level. And that, to me, maybe is the story of my 3 careers together, is think systems to solve big problems. If you think cell, if I'm a battery supplier and I'm confined to my cell and that's all I can do, I can only solve the problem in a reasonably confined set of constraints, and then I can't really progress. If I solve it at a system level, where I take pack engineering, I take cell engineering, I take the architecture of everything in consideration, then I can move up a ladder to solve the problem at a higher level of density than what was previously offered in the field. And that's what we worked on.
Okay. And so where are we today, snapshot of the global electric vehicle battery market? What share is nickel, cobalt? What share is LFP?
It's really starkly divided between what goes on in China and what has gone on in the rest of the world. Now, China has scaled LFP at a remarkably fast as well as high-quality state. It's everything from the processing of raw materials to the building of cells, to then the development of packs. And architecturally, LFP is in the fabric of transit buses, the grid, and now automotive. And in the context of range, range was not actually the primary driver. When China first commercialized electric vehicles, they held a safety standard higher than the rest of the world for thermal runaway not being acceptable. And therefore, it discounted the value of nickel cobalt right from the beginning, almost never even getting a chance to take root in that market. So the economy of battery went off into the direction of LFP. And really, a lot of Western markets looked at it and thought, shrug my shoulders, don't know why. That seems like a kind of a long waste of time. The range isn't enough. It won't satisfy our markets. We're going nickel cobalt. And 95% of the Western world has gone nickel cobalt. Now, nickel cobalt has another problem I haven't talked about, which is the supply chain of cobalt. Cobalt is very constrained, DRC being 55% of global supply, and now ever rising in price and having ESG-related problems with respect to the human rights aspects of how mining is done. And in the context of cobalt, nickel cobalt's prices have gone up. Ukraine-Russia conflict has caused nickel prices to go up because that's 40% of the global supply of nickel. So in the context of where nickel cobalt is, it's got now three problems. It has a cobalt problem, supply chain could be broken. There's a nickel problem, which is costs have doubled. And then it has a thermal runaway problem. Okay. And there have been 6 NHTSA recalls. So in the context, that's where global markets have actually bifurcated. Yeah. And we're seeing a new trend that's emerging now.
So I want to double click, if you will, on this thermal runaway issue. So this to me is a big deal, right? We look around this show and we see many beautiful products, electric vehicles, and many of those beautiful products are powered by nickel, cobalt-based battery chemistries. And you're saying that these 6 NHTSA recalls are an indicator that there is a safety issue, and that if this continues to scale, we will have further problems. And let me just question that. I mean, what's the evidence that you base that assertion that there's a safety issue?
Yeah, I think that the way you have to think through from an engineering lens is an engineering analysis says, if something happens, what's the result? It's a failure modes and effects analysis. And in that view, if you have a cell with an internal defect of any type that causes a short, and that can be manufacturing related, it can be something that happens during a crash, that event, it can be anything can cause that short. You have to understand what's the effect of that. And if you make a small cylindrical cell and put thousands of them together, if one cell fails, you can prevent that heat energy from igniting the next and the next by system design. And that's why I think cylindrical cells in the nickel cobalt family have made a lot of sense to date. Mm-hmm. You do that in a very large cell where you're grouping together maybe hundreds of amp hours of capacity or over 100 amp hours. That cell releases a significant amount of energy, not just locally to its neighbors, but in heat gas as well. And that can ignite the rest of the cells that are around it. And that's really the risk, is that you have one cell fail, does it ignite the rest? And by the way, when it ignites the rest, it is very hard to stop that amount of heat, and that massive influx of heat leads to a vehicle level related problem. And in India, for example, there was a three-wheeler that caught on fire charging, and then the next one caught on fire, and then 80 caught on fire on a line of charging vehicles. And that context was played out in the possibility that regardless of where the fire started on the Dutch ship, regardless of where it started, the electric vehicles did not let it stop. Because once one ignited, it went to the next, the next, the next. And that context is we have to be careful that thermal runaway, once it is allowed to progress past that first cell, can lead to a catastrophic failure. And that's where the failure mode and the effect is actually playing out in the market.
Okay, all right. And by the way, Don Sadoway, one of our faculty members at MIT, completely agrees with this assessment that you just gave. I just think it's interesting because we're here at the IAA. It's all about electrification, and yet you know, fortunately, thankfully, there haven't been that many incidents, but it is a very real factor to consider in our planning.
I look at it like this. There's no automotive company, and I've driven electric cars for 15 years, and many of them nickel cobalt. There's no automotive company that doesn't do its diligence and do it well on designing well-engineered products that are safe. I actually want to make sure that I'm on record as saying that I am not a disbeliever in the ability to build and design safe battery products. However, as an engineer, you have to design for the worst case condition. And if something in the worst case condition can result in that possible thermal runaway, at which point then it's not just a battery failure, but a product, the whole vehicle comes into the harm's way, and then even neighboring vehicles. That is the kind of thing that if we imagine not just 1% adoption, but we get to 50% adoption, then where all garages are filled with electric cars, what we want is the immunity in all kinds of conditions that kind of failure can lead to a wider result. That's why I imagined forward a decade and thought, what could harm the ability for this electrification movement to take root? One is public sentiment. If public sentiment is, okay, I don't want that in my garage, that can dramatically deter and even delay this market taking root. That's why I thought about safety being the #1 topic.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying that. I think it's really important to get the messaging spot on here, and that clarifies. We will be opening this up to all of you for questions. There is a woman over here with a microphone. Just before we do that, as you think about your questions, one last question for you, Mujeeb, and that gets into this issue of how does the electric vehicle battery fit more broadly into, let's say, a future distributed energy system?
Yeah. I make the analogy often that phones were typically thought of as communication only. Now we think of a phone as it's your app store, it's your banking, it's your Uber, Lyft, it's a lot of other functions. Electric vehicles are not a transportation-only evolution. I believe it is the distributed energy source for the future of grid. It's how buildings will more energy efficiently manage power. For example, an electric car today, all the cars show up, they plug into a charging receptacle at work, and the job of the work site is to deploy energy and charge all the electric cars. That's an inefficient way to manage energy, because what would be better is the cars and the users are making settings that say, I'm willing to sell you energy today, and the buildings are bidirectionally constantly using and then redeploying energy to the vehicles that are connected to make the energy transfer and the power profile of that building more efficient to the grid, and saving money at the same time, and even returning investment to the owners of these electric cars. It's such a massive aggregated energy storage asset, it would make no sense to confine it to transportation only when it can do residential, workplace, and even distributing security in the grid for storage itself. So I think bidirectionality is coming, and then the user's ability to monetize that asset in different ways is coming, much like the phone did much more 15 years later than we thought it could. I think electric cars are in the same category.
Yeah. As somebody who lives in a home with solar panels on the roof, I would absolutely love it if I could use the battery in my car to charge up during the day and then power the lights and the appliances in the evening.
Exactly.
I hope soon we will see that technology progress.
Exactly. Great.
Okay, how about some questions from the audience? Any questions for Mujeeb, please? Okay, we have a question over here. And if you could just briefly say your name and the organization you're with.
Okay. Hi. Yes. Hi, Mujeeb. Hi, John. My name is Nipun Kaushik. I am a research student at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'm also working on battery technology over there. One of the main questions I have for you is specifically within the sphere of battery technologies, which is, well, has been rapidly innovating at least for the last 5-10 years. How do you manage to stay on top with being somewhat competitive, especially given that there's so much emphasis being placed on, let's say, solid-state batteries, sodium-ion batteries, all of these new chemistries that are coming in. How do you still promote yourself, or at least stay somewhat relevant within the sphere? Because it's so easy to feel outdated just by, let's say, CATL coming out with the 500 watt-hour per kilogram battery.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great question, and I appreciate that. The idea of our battery architecture is to allow a dual chemistry to also be an approach for extending range. And in the dual chemistry approach, we confine the lithium iron phosphate everyday battery to approximately 250 kilometers or 150 miles a day. And then we have a second chemistry that we lowered the requirements for to meet automotive requirements by 90% on power and life. As we did that, we are the easiest and first channel to market for the next big innovations, because typically when you scientifically break through a battery chemistry and improve energy density, the first things that happen in that architectural breakthrough are that you're trying to figure out how to meet all of the requirements. We reduced life and power by 90% and a range extender architecture where you can put energy in one bucket and slowly fill the traction battery that's durable, that's safe, that has all the attributes of automotive. Then you have this dual battery path where the second battery can rapidly innovate even faster than today's market allows, because we reduce those requirements. And so our innovation strategy to stay ahead of the market is to adopt the first to market strategies for next generation multi-electron conversion chemistries, as an example, that can go way beyond lithium ion where it is today.
And then on top of that, you talked about, of course, setting up a supply chain within, the North American sphere. I can imagine that's probably one of the most difficult things to do. And so far with RNX Energy, what are the main challenges that you face so far?
Well, we had to decide that abundance was the first primary architectural decision in picking a battery chemistry. It wasn't which chemistry performed the best, it's what materials are the most abundant. Because if we're talking about 8 billion people being serviced by electrification on residential, grid, and automotive, all platforms being electric, we need the fundamentals of material supply chain to be globally relevant and abundant. So iron and manganese became our two most important chemistry platforms for cathode material. And on anode, we're actually using graphite and even zero graphite, or anode free, to develop a market that's robust and that can scale. And that's how we've approached the supply chain as well.
And one last question. A little bit more about, let's say, the thermal runaways that you mentioned. Do you ever see, for example, car batteries being fitted with, a smaller heat battery as well, as a thermal storage system? As batteries themselves scale, their operating temperatures go up as well. And since it's easier to, for example, manage the runaway as compared to an engine, for example, that it would make more sense to store that heat locally, for example.
Yeah, in the context of needing the peripheral systems to work, electric vehicles have two taxes. One is all the sensors, auxiliaries have to run, like radar, LiDAR, all the autonomous things that are coming. That's a lot of tax. The second is climate. Climate control, heat, and cooling is another tax. So in actually doing system design, coming up with efficient, clever ways to store energy, whether it's in the form of heat or batteries, is a good idea, and that's where automotive platforms and systems thinking can also benefit the future of electric cars, is get rid of tax on maybe the battery and move it to another storage technique, if that makes more sense from a system design perspective.
Excellent. We are at time, so please, thank you very much. Join me in thanking Mujeeb.
Appreciate your time.
If any of you have further questions, we are just circling through, and we will be reappearing out of that door in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.